to Saturday Shred Show. I'm Chris Bro, and this has been a wild week in surfing. If you're like me, you wondered how Surfline was able to break into Studio Shred to film their World Champions Roundtable in an all-black background. And even if you ignored surf media for the last 7 days, you probably still saw CNN's coverage of Maya Gabeira nearly drowning in Portugal. According to Laird Hamilton, that girl has no business surfing waves like that, but according to Tom Carroll and Ross Clark-Jones, she is entirely competent, confident, and knows exactly what she's doing. Well, according to me, no one should surf a wave that big, even if it is a mush burger that's barely breaking. As if my opinion mattered. But in the most exciting surf news of the week, we got a Simon Anderson board on Shred Show, which is a big deal because they're not super easy to get a hold of in America, although that might be changing soon. So Australia, consider this a big shout out to you. Aussie, Aussie, Aussie! If you live outside of Australia or haven't been surfing that long, Simon Anderson is the person who's widely hailed as being the first designer and surfer of a thruster. Thruster refers to the fin configuration that most everyone is used to, where you have 3 fins in your board, 1 in the back, 2 in the front, and with the 2 leading fins much smaller than twin fins. It's called a thruster because relative to other boards at the time, this new 3-fin setup gave you a lot of thrust through your turns. And that's partly why all the pro surfers that you see in the ASP today can do all those big turns and hold speed on rail, while pros in the 70s were breaking into turns really quickly but couldn't hold that much speed because of the twin fin setup. What's great about Simon is that despite being responsible for one of the evolutionary leaps in board design that brought us to where we are today, he has kept an open mind and continued pushing design frontiers with surfers like Jeremy Flores, Kelly Slater, and others. If you know anything about technology startups, and realistically, do any of you even pay attention to that sort of thing, you know that a tech founder like Mark Zuckerberg, for example, is only as good as their ability to create multiple new ideas in succession. One idea is never enough. Simon Anderson seems to be able to churn out all sorts of cool stuff, not just standard old thrusters. That says a lot when you consider that he could just kick back for the rest of his life and be like, I'm that dude that created the thruster. In fact, this board was originally designed as a quad during one of Simon's yearly trips to France. Single concave getting fairly deep. Single concave all the way through the board until right after the thruster box. V, all the way out through the tail, tells us a lot about how this will surf as a quad. When you surf this board with 4 fins, you've got 2 fins pretty close to the rail, 2 fins kind of close to the rail, and this big open space right down the center. That means that if you were surfing this board and you were moving this way away from the camera, you could rock the board up onto a rail pretty easy, but transitioning to your other rail, some would say it doesn't feel that smooth because you don't have that normal transition point that a thruster gives you, where you're transferring from here to here to here as you switch to your other rail. A few years ago, Sean Madison developed this little nubster fin, and when you put it in the thruster box of your quad, it allows you to smooth out your turns and have a bit more control to the speed that a quad gives you. In a very subtle way, the V back here behind the thruster box does the same thing, allowing you to connect your turns in a more fluid way than this board would if it was just a flat out the back without a V. In parts of the world with average waves, quads are generally thought of as a way to generate speed when the waves are really weak and not that good. But in steep barreling waves, quads can give you extra hold in the face as you're dropping in beneath a section pitching over you. That's because of all the area that these fins put in the face of a wave, adding more stability to the way that you set your line dropping in. Then at that critical moment, when you do your first pump to beat that critical section, you can generate speed more quickly than with a thruster for the same reason. You have more surface area in your fins that you're able to leverage to generate speed like a gas pedal to get pushed forward to the safe zone. Using a straight edge is a very crude way to look at rocker curves, but if we set this back here, we see something similar to what we saw in episode 12. Across the stringer back here, this is very flat. We can't rock this at all, and that tells us that within the last 4 inches of this board right here behind the thruster fin, this board has an emphasis on drive and speed through turns, not a lot of rocker or a flip back here that would make this want to pivot up towards the lip and flick off the top. Moderate amount of rocker in the nose and the tail of this board, and the very familiar quality of a slightly wider nose and a wide point that's a bit more forward than what you traditionally see in a high-performance shortboard like Simon Anderson's XFC model, for example. This is an epoxy board built in XF construction, and my experience on this type of epoxy is that it does a wonderful job of maintaining the same strength as polyurethane, but without the weight. This board is really, really light. In fact, this brand of epoxy is about 80% easier to juggle than your standard shortboard. The positive benefits to a construction like this in epoxy is that it is so light, it's able to float over crumbly sections really easy, and it also deals with whitewater really well because it's so buoyant. These XF boards are also pretty easy to maneuver because they're so light, you can kind of just throw them around under your feet however you choose. Some would say, however, that the downside to surfing a board this light is that it doesn't deal with chop on the water that well, because when your board is heavy, it can kind of plow through imperfections on the surface of the ocean. But when your board is this light, it's harder to hold your line through wind chop, but maybe windy days aren't really your cup of tea anyway. This is a pretty low, soft rail. Low meaning low volume. It's not a full, buoyant, boxy rail. And soft meaning this is a soft edge under here with a really hard edge back here in the tail. To make sense of that, imagine pouring water out of a glass like this and it just shears out and pours nicely. Then imagine pouring water out of a coffee mug or something with a wider, more rounded edge right here and it doesn't really pour. Instead, it just sort of grips to the edge of it and drizzles down the side of the cup and makes a mess. That really makes sense when you consider that since we control the board with our back foot, we want water shearing off of the back end like this, not up here, because we use this kind of as an exhaust. These rails are designed to give you just enough volume through your turns to keep you buoyant, while giving you the opportunity to penetrate deeply down in the water to really dig into your turn without catching a rail and falling. That probably makes the performance characteristics of this board most friendly to surfers that are intermediate and advanced. I think this board is probably quite a fun option for anyone who wants to experiment with quad and thruster setups and waves that are pretty good about waist to a few feet overhead. You probably could push it down more on the low end if you really wanted to about knee high, if you wanted a board that would be really versatile. Simon Anderson likes surfing this board most as a thruster around Sydney, and I am most excited to surf it as a quad around San Diego if we ever get good waves around this part of the world again. That does it for this episode. If you've ever surfed the Face Dancer or any of Simon Anderson's boards, tell us what you think in the YouTube comments below. If you like the video, click like, not the thumb, but the button below the video on the left. If you want more episodes, click subscribe, and we hope the waves are up wherever you are until we see you next Saturday.